Years ago, I believe, you played a large part in gate-crashing the Fringe by bringing stand-up comedy to it.
Yeah.
What was that like back then?
Well, in some ways it was like now. We got ripped off by our promoter, just as you do these days. I mean, in 1980, there was me and a guy called Tony Allen. We're at the Heriot Watt, and we were put on by a kind of a university theatre group, and we were the only. I think we were the only stand-up comedy on the Fringe, and the student newspaper actually said, "I don't understand what this is." I mean, there was sketch comedy and stuff going on, and I suppose it felt very exciting.
I mean, did you find the audiences were receptive back then? Because they would have had a very different concept of what stand-up comedy was.
Well, I'd spent a year comparing the Comedy Store, which was the only, comedy club, and so I had a big reputation in London. But when we came to Edinburgh, it was supposed to be that we're going to alternate who was top of the bill, each night and stuff like that. And the first night I went on, without me realising it, because I'd been emceeing, my act was actually broken up into chunks.
Yeah.
And so I sort of ground through one chunk, and then there was a kind of slight pause where an act would have normally come on, and then I went on to the next chunk. And I died really badly on the first night. I absolutely died. And I was so tremendously upset, and I was up all night, and I was just kind of crazed with, and the next day everybody was like, well, I think Tony will headline, in fact, and you can be second banana. I mean, it just burned me up. And so, because I was so full of rage and I hadn't slept and I was so upset, that night I went on first, and what I did was I took my entire act, which had been in chunks, and just completely blew it up, and so that it was just sprinkled it, so words from one bit would be in another bit, and just like completely smashed it on the ground. And so there was this furious kind of rant that kind of transfixed the audience, just kind of madness and hate and stuff. After that, there was never an argument about who was top of the bill, and that made my name that night, really, in the Heriot Watt. And also then word started to get around, and it was sold out every night. And,
yeah, because it must have been so far from people's concept of a fairly polite guy in a sort of dinner suit telling mother-in-law jokes.
In retrospect, you do think, being screamed at by a fat man in a torn mohair suit, as a kind of entertainment concept, there's nobody in Las Vegas thinking, that's what we need.
A lot of your comedy from early in your career has reflected on your sort of family's communist roots and the role that communism played in your upbringing. I mean, how influential was that in terms of something to react against, or something that made you think in a different way from other comedians?
Essentially, by being brought up in the Communist Party, I was brought up in a cult. Religious cult, political cult, and they are identical.
Do you feel it kind of inoculated you with a sense of its own absurdity?
For me, it did, because I never believed it. I both believed it and didn't believe it. There's a story. On the first day at school, I was at primary school, and our teacher, Miss Wilson, said, class, let's put our hands together and thank God for the milk. And I put my hand up and I said, no, Miss Wilson, I think you'll find that the milk comes from the Milk Marketing Board, which is a semi-autonomous government organisation which buys the milk and then collectivises it, and by pooling the price of the milk forces it up so that members of the working class... Kids, to the sandpit! Take it over, hold it! And that was like what I was, but at the same time, I think even at 5, I had an idea. One, that I was attracting attention to myself deliberately, but 2, that I also knew that I was talking bollocks in a sense. I mean, I was right about the Milk Marketing Board, but I believed in communism. At the same time, I knew it was crap from a very early age.
I read somewhere that as a child you loved reading the Biggles books. Was that something that was just so removed from what you'd been...
Well, I think so. So maybe that was an early point where I was open to a voice switch, because they were actually, especially in the end, very anti-communist, the later Biggles and stuff. But I was always much more interested in hearing voices that challenged my point of view, you know. And my parents would have liked me to read communist propaganda, but no, I always wanted to read stuff that challenged, you know, their worldview and my worldview, really. I remember Biggles was always sitting down and eating a pork pie and having a fag. I always remember. It seemed very attractive, really. I don't know why.
Before you did stand-up, you studied art, and another creative outlet. Would you say your attitude to art changed as a result of doing stand-up, or as a result of your political transformations?
You know, it was a way that kids who were bright but weren't academic could go to college. And so, you know, I was very fortunate I could draw, because otherwise I wouldn't have got an education. And I loved foundation. I did 2 years foundation at a little college in Lancashire. Then I got into Chelsea for 3 years, and that was a much more difficult experience for me. It was the first time that I came up against the upper classes, really. Yeah. I remember sitting in the first week in an art history lecture, and the lecturer put up a slide of a Van Gogh painting, and a girl in the class said, "Oh yes, I know that. The original's in the hall of our flat in Rome." I thought, it's not even in the living room, you know what I mean? It's in the hall. Yeah. What have they got in the living room, you know? Yes, the ceiling's by Michelangelo.
You were famously the first MC of the Comedy Store, and did you have a sense of creating something new as a collective at that time, or was it a bit more shambolic and less planned than that?
I mean, I think on your good days, you felt like this is the Cavern in 1963, this is, you know, Sun Records in Memphis in 1950, whenever, you know, this club is the centre of a revolution.
So you knew something different was happening.
You did. On your bad days, it didn't, you know, and certainly it was a bit of a shock when we did our first national tour, and Peter Richardson, who had this kind of also, he liked that kind of demi-monde thing. So I remember we opened in a porn cinema in Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow, and they walked
the
through
classic Grand.
Was it the Grand, was it? Yeah. I remember the dressing room was underwater. That's true. Now I recognise you.
I believe it was called the Classic Grand. I've got an interest in Art Deco cinemas.
But that was, I mean, it was just, I mean, it was, and then I can't remember, I think we played some nightclub here, I think.
Well, were you conscious of reacting against the comedy of the time, the Bernard Mannings and the Stan Boardmans and the conventional...
Oh, absolutely. No, that was very deliberate in the sense that we sensed an opportunity, but also why would you want to be like those guys?
Well, did you find there was resentment from the comic establishment? I mean, how did you feel you were being perceived by the Jim Davidsons?
They hated us. Yeah, I mean, I used to do that joke. You know, I used to say I'm an alternative Marxist comedian, you know. I'm an alternative comedian. I'm not funny. I used to say, if you don't laugh at me, you're a Nazi shitbag. And then they used to say, yeah, you're an alternative comedian, you're not funny. I said, I just said that. Yeah, I know, it's a joke, you moron. And they were obviously very, again, intelligent working class guys, but they'd been driven kind of insane by the life that they lived, this kind of touring of these horrible clubs and being, you know, halfway through a joke and being yanked off for the bingo, you know, and kind of, I mean, a lot of those old style comics were sometimes thrown off the TV simply because the executives found us much more genial to go out to dinner with. I mean, if you were going to go out to dinner, you'd rather go out to dinner with, you know, Tommy and Bobby, you know, I mean, Cannon and Ball. I'm getting excited, Tommy, you know. Or French and Saunders, you know, I mean, who would you rather go out to dinner with, you know, because Tommy, I'm getting excited, who am I going to say? You know, or these, you know, terribly well brought up girls, you know, erudite, charming, you know, I mean, so there was a kind of a very unfair call in some ways. I don't know if I've hallucinated this, but Paul Jackson, who did the first series of The Young Ones, he was then put on to directing Cannon and Ball for LWT, and he got rid of their old writers and he got people like Richard Curtis in. And I've got this image of Tommy and Bobby doing a sketch written by Richard Curtis about Plato. You can see it's all about Plato's Republic, you know, and Aristotle, you know. You see Tommy and Bobby go, I don't know what I'm talking about, Tommy. Jasper Carrott was doing this live show, and Rick Mayall and Lisa Mayer, his girlfriend, who'd written The Young Ones, they wrote this recurring sketch for Jasper called Dave the Cardboard Box, which was about the adventures of this cardboard box. And it was filmed stuff, and like Dave goes to the park. It was actually very funny, but Jasper hated it. And I remember the show would go out live, and Jasper would say things like, say, oh, we've got another Dave the Cardboard Box coming up now. It's really not funny at all. But you're going to have to watch it anyway. And he'd sort of sit there, and the camera would cut to this sketch with Dave the Cardboard Box on a string, and you cut back to Jasper going, well, that was shit, wasn't it? Culture wars.
So, the comic strip Presents was a massive phenomenon in the 1980s into the 90s, but I gather you had to be convinced to take part initially.
Oh, I was such a dick when I was younger. I had this idea, I don't know why, I had this idea that because we were on BBC Two doing the young ones, we shouldn't be on Channel 4 doing the comic strip, even though everybody else who was in the young ones was in the comic strip as well.
Were the rest of them a bit scared of you?
Well, they were until they realised I was just stupid. So they just went ahead. They got Robbie Coltrane in instead of some other fat guy, And eventually I realised I was being stupid, and so I was in, I think the first comic strip I did was the movie Supergrass, I think, and then Strike. And,
did you need to be the outsider a wee bit, even in a group that you were perceived to be part of? Did you feel you had to sort of position yourself slightly outside even that?
I guess that's a reasonable explanation, though. That's the most sensible explanation of my behaviour I've ever heard. Yeah,
I mean, you are alleged to have attempted to strangle the owner of the comedy store.
I did.
What precipitated that?
Oh, well, I'd done too many shows that day, and he was being kind of obnoxious. It was some row. He was trying to get Keith Allen on, and Keith didn't want to go on, and I just got him up against the wall and throttled him.
Did he see your point of view better after that? Or?
I don't think he ever did, really, no. I mean, that was the night I quit the Comedy Store, and then I came up to Edinburgh, in fact, so, it kind of all worked out, really. And then, while I was up in Edinburgh, Peter Richardson rang me and said he was opening the comic strip.
And it's 31 years since you tried to strangle somebody, or has there been more?
No.
Just you've had success on so many fronts and so many media, but do you think you could have had even more if you hadn't had such strong ideas and been so forceful and tried to strangle people and things like that? If you'd just gone along for the ride a bit more? Or?
I regret that behaviour now. I think it was idiotic, and I think I was often too difficult and too kind of crazy and stuff. But when you're inventing an art form, as we were really, that you make a lot of mistakes, both personal mistakes and business mistakes, that the modern comedian has either through osmosis or literally learned from our mistakes. Again, like opening in the porn cinema and stuff, you learn not to do that. A modern comic will choose the right management, the right accountant. Somebody like Russell Brand has stylists and people who write his autodidactic bon mot for him, And when we had none of that, the guy who was my first manager, I remember he'd met his girlfriend. His parents had put him in a mental institution, and his girlfriend had been serving the food there. And I thought, this is the guy I want for my manager.
One of the ways you branched out, as I alluded to at the top of the programme, was that you had hit singles with A Low John Got a New Motor and Didn't You Kill My Brother. So a case might actually be made for claiming you, given that was the early 1980s, as the first British rap star.
Yes, I think so. I'll claim anything like that. I am like the Soviet Union, and I claim to have invented everything. I mean, it was produced by Clive Langer, who produced all the Madness and then wrote one of the greatest pop songs of all time, I think, which is Shipbuilding with Elvis Costello. And I went into the studio, he laid down a track, and then I improvised, and we started about midnight. It was the old Basin Street Studios, Island Records. And we just improvised for hours and hours and hours. I keep tropical fish in my underpants and all that stuff. And then I went home, and Clive spent the next day or something cutting up bits of tape. And so it was, in a way, the first improvised record that ever got in the charts. And also, of course, the B-side of the 12-inch is just swearing. And it was a massive hit in German discos. And sometimes I would be approached by kind of Germans going, "Oh yes, I like your hello, John God, new mother. I like very much the use of the demotic swearing, the obscenity. I find, I would be dancing in the 80s in a club in Hamburg. Yes, I love it very much. I like it very much. Very, 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 very moved by this use of the distinctive vernacular, The other thing was that the other one, Didn't You Kill My Brother, was a big hit in Canada, because for some reason MTV Canada and CBS, I think it was. And we were on the Metro in Montreal, because I went out to promote it. Not Montreal, Toronto. And a group got on from a special school. And one of the kids looked at me and he said, "Didn't you kill my brother?" And the teacher said, "No, Tommy, that was you."
Well, one thing you must be enduringly proud of is your several series of Alexei Sayle stuff and the all-new Alexei Sayle show. And you drew on a phenomenal lineup of writing and performing talent in those days.
Stuff was written by me and David Rennick, who went on to do One Foot in the Grave, and Jonathan Creek, and then Andrew Marshall, who did 2.4 Children, and then All New Alexei Sayle show was written, but was the first really big piece of TV writing that I gave to Graham Linehan and Arthur Matthews, who then went on to do Father Ted and IT Crowd. And
I think it was the All New Alexei Sayle show won the Bronze Rose of Montreux.
The Bronze Rose of Montreux.
But I gather you were done out of the gold due to the machinations of a spiteful priest.
An undercover priest, yes.
Undercover priest.
He was on the judging panel. He was Irish, but he was from Vatican TV. And he said, "You're not gonna win the gold because of those things you said about the Pope." He said, "I'm gonna make it my role to stop you winning the Golden Rose of Montreux." And he did, so I don't say I haven't suffered for my beliefs. I've suffered. I lost out on a pointless Euro award because of the things I said about the Pope.
Do you remember what it was you said about the Pope?
I don't, but I was banned from the Olympia Theatre in Dublin. I remember that, again, because they said, "You're banned." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because of them things you said about the Pope." But what it was, I don't know. But it almost certainly turned out to be true, whatever it was.
Well, in recent years, you've given yourself over more and more to the printed word, and you once compared your sort of newfound love of writing fiction to being like a middle-aged man besotted with his second wife. Do you feel you've really found yourself in writing now? I mean, after the kind of the hard knock world of light entertainment, which is, there's a kind of levels of, in the entertainment business, of pond scum, really. I mean, and at the very bottom, the murkiest depths is advertising, and then the music business, and then kind of light entertainment, comedy, and then movies, and then kind of publishing, where everybody... I was saying, when I first published by Methuen, and I had this very nice, very old world publisher called Jeffrey Strawn at Methuen, and one day we were going through a door in which you punch in the code, and Jeffrey punched it in, and he turned to me and he said, "Oh, it's really easy to remember, it's the Treaty of Utrecht." A handy mnemonic for anyone.
Well, I said, "Bloody hell, Jeffrey, you want to change that quick." I mean, once the burglars have done 1, 2, 3, 4,
it's the same
Treaty of Utrecht, you know what I mean?
Comedians I've spoken to who've turned to writing have said that the thing that strikes them is that in the world of literature, people are kind of enjoy each other's successes, whereas in stand-up comedy, the worst thing anybody wants to see is one of their friends doing well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you would... you just... Yes. Yeah.
You miss the immediacy of performing before an audience because there's a big gap between writing something. In fact, you don't even know how a book is received by the reader, but you do get that immediate feedback from an audience.
I didn't for years, I think. I mean, because I think I'd felt so hampered by comedy that I'd reached the limit of what I could do. And I think the wonderful thing about literature is that you can entertain such complex ideas, You notice my voice has actually changed as I started speaking. I was talking like that when I was talking about light entertainment. Now I'm talking like this. Now I'm talking about literature.
You've entered a completely different vocal idiom.
I have, yes.
It's
exactly.
like a priest when a priest talking to you normally and then suddenly goes to start talking like this.
I wouldn't know, but I was just thrilled by the whole business of writing. I didn't miss that immediacy, but I am starting to miss it a little bit now. But,
In one of your monologues, I remember, and as a writer I can really identify with this, you made reference to the great writer's craft of procrastination, claiming that the Great Wall of China was in fact built by a writer with a deadline approaching. I'll just adjust another couple of bricks, you know.
I've forgotten that. It's really funny, isn't it?
The audience seems to think so. I mean, is that still the case? Do you feel that all of a sudden the housework gets done a lot more quickly if you've got something you should be working on?
I wish I was one of those writers who sat down, banged out 2,000 words, and then, you know, like Kingsley Amis or something, went off to the Garrick Club. I mean, that I wish I was like, I don't personally know how I write, that somehow the stuff gets done, but I'm not really aware often of actually doing it. The day kind of just goes in a kind of haze. And that's my writing process, you know.
Do you think now that you're full-time concentrating on writing, do you think it's difficult for people to separate the comedian Alexei Sayle from the author Alexei Sayle? Are you feeling you're still carrying around the sort of tabloid tag, you know, TV funny man?
I think it's both good and bad. I mean, funny enough, me and my friend went to a little exhibition of John Byrne's paintings, and she was telling me that he found in his early days that he couldn't get, people wouldn't buy his painting, so he invented this persona, which was his granddad who lived in a fishing hut somewhere, and this old guy. And then suddenly people were buying the guy's paintings. They were the same paintings, but because there was this different narrative attached to it that they'd been produced by a 70-year-old fisherman, like the Beatles were buying them and stuff like that. And a lot of the paintings were signed Patrick, and that was his alter ego. And then he had to admit, you know, and so people are, I mean, the world is very susceptible. We think we only buy things because of the quality of the writing, but I think there is also that the narrative that the author presents affects, I think, both, you know, it affects, you can see it, I think, often, that the people buy the book not because of the book, but to some extent because of who the author is.
Yeah, because people are going to have a very vivid sense of the voice that they'll expect from a book that you've written because of the extent to which they're familiar with the voice that you've spoken with on TV or on stage.
Yeah, and in fact my books I don't think are like that, you know, and so I think that, I think that I am to some extent. Yeah, there is a level of critical response, of critical seriousness that I don't get. I mean, again, it is money because I mean, my stuff has got fantastic reviews. So again, this is self-pitying, whining. But I should get even better reviews and I should have got the Booker by now. I mean, I thought.
Sure, it's only a matter of time. And when you think to the future, then can you ever imagine circumstances under which you'd return to comedy? Do you think you maybe just the odd wee hit of it now and again?
I haven't. I mean, I do book readings anyway, that I do tour art centres doing book readings, and they are fairly comedic. But they are, rather than that persona of the guy in the tight suit, that they are me, I mean, the me that you're seeing now. And so I did stuff that was about me. I mean, I said, it was at the Royal Festival Hall, and I said, the last time I appeared at the Royal Festival Hall, which was in 1984, and it was a miners' benefit for the miners' strike, and I said that I travelled all up and down the country, 84, 85, doing benefits.